I'm Eugene Goltz. I'd like to welcome you all to the fourth and final Robert Strauss Center on International Security and Law, International Security Speaker Series event for the fall semester. That was a mouthful. I probably could have said that a better way. In any event, this is our fourth event. We will have a series in the spring. It's going to be exciting too. I can't tell you about it yet. It's all highly classified. But we will. In the meantime, it's my great pleasure to introduce Mike Desch, the Robert Gates Chair of Intelligence and National Security Decision Making at the little-known school down the road, the Bush School of Government and Public Service. Did I get the title right?
Yep. Excellent.
At Texas A&M University. Mike is a leading and distinguished scholar in international security and a great personal friend, which I double good reason to have him come give a talk. He has spent a lot of time writing about American foreign policy and military policy. He's done work on civil-military relations. He's done work on the United States in Latin America, foreign policy towards Latin America. He's engaged in big theory debates in security studies about the role of, say, culture and how important that is as a variable, and that is, and then on very policy-oriented issues. Before he was teaching at the policy school at the Bush School, he was also the director of another international affairs program with a policy orientation, professional policy studies at the University of Kentucky. So he really runs the gamut and has in one person the blend of the kind of people that we like at the LBJ School and in the Strauss Center. I hope we're bridging. A lot of people from the Gov department and history department are here, so we're trying to reach out between the policy, professional, practitioner side of the world and the more traditional academic, disciplinary side of the world in the Robert Strauss Center, and Mike really embodies that bridge just in himself. So I'm very pleased that he's going to talk to us. Today I mentioned that he had written on a paper that was subsequently published under a very erudite academic title, but at one time we all referred to it as the Culture Schmulture paper. And so today he's going to tell us, given the background that he thinks culture schmulture, about the important role of American political culture in talking about, in causing current American foreign policy.
Was it Dr. Johnson who said, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of a small mind"?
Right.
Save that for the Q&A period. I wheedled Gene to have the opportunity to come over and peddle my wares, and he sort of put me off, and then he finally said, "Hey, we've got a great date for you. You know, why don't you come over Tuesday, November 7th, and talk? We've got an opening in the schedule that he was just saving for me." So I can't tell you how grateful I am that you are all coming this evening to hear me tell you that how the election comes out today will be irrelevant because liberalism is now bipartisan. That's not really my message, but it is going to be the case that I'm going to argue tonight that the differences between the two parties, the Democrats and the Republicans, on the global war on terrorism are not as great as many people think, and indeed not as great as they should be. And I think the problem comes down to what I'm going to talk about in depth tonight, which is the liberal tradition in America. Now, I started this paper with a puzzle, and maybe you won't think it's a puzzle, but I think it's a puzzle, and that's this question about why liberal America has embraced the illiberal policies that it has as of late. Do I get a pointer? Oh, I do get a pointer on this. And the key examples that I pointed to in terms of foreign policy have been the willingness of the United States to enshrine and embrace preventive war now as a matter of formal doctrine, although Frank's mentor, Mark Trachtenberg, will tell us that that's gone on for a long time. But also, whoops, there we go. Also, an explicit commitment to making the achievement and the maintenance of international hegemony, which some people refer to even as empire, as a central part or goal of American foreign policy. So internationally, I think we're behaving in a way that seems, at least rhetorically, inconsistent with a lot of the liberal values that we seem to espouse. And I think domestically, there's been plenty of examples of increasing illiberalism, or at least departure from our liberal tradition. In the area, for example, of the restriction of civil liberties, your colleague Sandy Levinson has written quite a bit about this. Just the whole panoply of restrictions on domestic liberties that have come about as a result of the USA Patriot Act. But the most extreme manifestations of that, it seems to me, is the explicit use of rendition in torture as elements or weapons in the global war on terrorism. Now, the reason I said that maybe you don't think that this is a puzzle or a paradox is you think this is a pretty straightforward thing. Historically, war has been the great engine of the restriction of civil liberties and liberalism within the state. Harold Lasswell's famous garrison state argument is only the latest in a long line of thinking that suggests that war is the enemy of individual liberty. And a lot of people would say, look, there's no puzzle here. We've become a less liberal country simply because of what happened on September 11th and the exiges of the waging the global war on terrorism. Okay, and that's really sort of the conventional view. But what I want to argue tonight is something different. I want to argue that the roots of current American illiberalism have nothing to do, or have very little to do, with 9/11, and everything to do with what Louis Hartz called America's liberal tradition. And I'm going to unpack that in some detail over the course of the next, what do I have, 25 minutes, and I'll still be in your good graces?
You will.
Now, for those of you, how many people, we got all these young people in the room, and Hartz, who was once a staple of American political development, I suspect is probably not as widely read as he once was. But how many people have read the liberal tradition in America? Yeah, all the old coots here, and then a couple of young guys. Well, I'll unpack Hartz's argument at some length for you. Suffice to say that Hartz argues that the problem with American liberalism really comes down to Locke. Okay, and I'll lay that argument out in a little bit more detail. My argument, though, is if you want to indict liberalism for contemporary American foreign policy, the liberal you want to look to is not Locke, it's Immanuel Kant. And I'll unpack that argument in a little bit greater detail. But let me just give you sort of an idea of where I want to go. I don't think 9/11 at all made inevitable the manifestations of illiberalism that I identified before. I think it's only 9/11 as seen through our liberal tradition that has put us in the situation that we're in today. And basically, what I'm going to argue is that our liberal tradition, and I'll say more exactly about what I mean by this in a minute, but it leads us to see the global war on terrorism as a very different type of war and a much more perilous sort of war than any sort of war we've been in before. A lot of people talk about the global war on terrorism being World War IV, which, when you think about it on the face of it, is absolutely crazy, except in the narrowest geographical sense that our enemies in Al-Qaeda are operating from a number of different countries around the world. To compare the war against Al-Qaeda with World War I or World War II is really quite strange. And we only do that because the liberal tradition leads us to see it as an extremely dangerous sort of war. Indeed, the threat that the liberal tradition leads us to perceive is not just a physical threat, which is serious to be sure. I mean, anytime anybody brings down two 100-story buildings in New York and kills almost 4,000 Americans, that's a real physical threat. But a lot of the rhetoric of the global war on terrorism has been more about the existential threat that Al-Qaeda and international terrorism present to the United States. So it's not so much about the physical damage that Al-Qaeda did to us, or I would argue even the physical damage they could inflict on us in the worst case scenario, but rather this existential threat that's summed up in the president's oft-repeated line that they hate our freedom. It's not just about, sort of the classic wars of statecraft, but it's something more fundamental. Finally, the liberal tradition argues or leads us to believe that the global war on terrorism can't be managed in the way that previous wars were, or intense security rivalries like the Cold War with the Soviet Union. That our enemies need to be extirpated. That's Hartz's word, and a word that Sam Huntington, in a very Hartzian vein, picks up in a number of things he did down the line. And I argue that, in fact, two seemingly different strategies for fighting and winning the global war on terrorism, in fact, spring from the same root. Whether it's the global imperative to spread democracy or a commitment to fight this war to basically the last terrorists that we can possibly kill. So let me just give you a little bit of a roadmap about where I want to go and then get into it. First, I want to sort of flesh out my liberal tradition argument. And for those of you who haven't read Hartz or aren't sort of au courant with this liberal tradition debate, I'll try to fill in a few of the blanks. Secondly, I want to make the argument, which I think by now is almost the conventional wisdom, that the current Bush administration, and especially the neoconservative intellectuals, both inside and outside the administration, who've been so influential in how we think about the global war on terrorism, in fact, are a part of America's liberal tradition, that in fact neoconservatism, despite some arguments to the contrary, is very much part of the American political tradition, or at least it builds, its roots go deeply in American political thought. Third thing I want to do is establish the links between the liberal tradition and America's increasing illiberalism, both abroad and at home. And then finally, I want to suggest, and this again, for those of you that know Hartz, is a classically Hartzian argument, that the antidote to American liberalism is not getting rid of American liberalism, but rather presenting American liberalism with a non-liberal challenge, a different way of looking at the world. In my view, realpolitik is the ideological counterweight that ought to be posed to America's liberal tradition. Okay, now let me say just a little bit about the liberal tradition and start with some definitions. I'm sorry, Jim Steinberg isn't here. I always reserve that spot of honor for special people. But when we're talking about liberalism, This is a word that's quite freighted in American politics, and we want to be clear how we're using it. I'm not talking about little L liberalism of the sort that we associate with Teddy or Hillary, or is that fair to Jim?
It's fine.
Okay, all right. Americans for Democratic Action, Mike Dukakis, ACLU, all these organizations, that's little L liberalism. The sort of liberalism that I'm talking about was Hartzian liberalism, big L liberalism, the liberalism of Adam Smith, Immanuel Kant, and for Louis Hartz, especially John Locke. And Lockean liberalism, in Hartz's view, really involves a combination of four basic premises. Okay, a commitment, first of all, to the central importance of preserving individual freedom, a commitment to equality of opportunity, a belief in the salutary effects of free markets and free trade, and finally a commitment to political representativeness and democracy, some form of plural political system. Now, all of those things seem like, well, what's the old saying? Motherhood, apple pie, Chevrolet, Friday night lights, football in Texas. I mean, how could any of that be bad? Everybody believes, or most everybody believes, and everybody would at least publicly maintain, that these premises of liberalism are sacrosanct. But Hartz's argument was that American liberalism was unique. And his argument basically comes down to the fact that America, in Tocqueville's famous formulation, was born democratic, and American liberalism never had to confront the ideological challenges that European liberalism did. And so it became a sort of extreme form of liberalism. And basically, it came to believe certain premises that shaped American liberalism's views of the world. And there are four important things that in particular it emphasizes. First of all is this notion that political and economic development is a relatively easy and unproblematic process. American liberals, much more than other liberals, in Hartz's view, believe that the road to democracy and the road to economic liberalism are relatively straight and relatively smooth. Secondly, American liberalism likes to believe that all good things go together. If you have democracy, you're going to have free markets. If you're going to have free markets, you're going to have cooperative social relations. If you have democracy, well, we'll talk about this a little bit further down the road about the contemporary manifestations of these all good things go together. But the point is that from the view of American liberalism, liberalism is unproblematic. If you have liberalism, it's all up and no downsides. The third premise is the notion that radicalism, and particularly revolution, are bad. That any change that one has or that a country goes through should be gradual and evolutionary, except for one important exception, and that's the notion that American liberals are willing to countenance a fair amount of disorder in the name of democratization. Okay. Now, for Hartz, all of this came together to produce what he famously referred to as liberalism's deep and unwritten tyrannical compulsion. Okay, and later people writing in the Hartzian vein sort of developed this argument a little bit and explained it by virtue of how these four premises, and remember these premises because we'll come back to them, can have untoward consequences. The first and second premise, in Bob Pakenham's terms, make us excessively optimistic or utopian. The third makes us counter-revolutionary or even reactionary in the face of radicalism. And the fourth inclines us towards a special kind of pretentiousness or arrogance. The notion that we're spreading democracy, and anything we do in the interest of spreading democracy has got to ultimately be a good thing. Now, Hartz dumped all this on John Locke and argued that it was Locke's influence on the American founding that basically was the wellspring of this unique form of American liberalism. In thinking about it, I'm not so sure that Locke ought to take the rap. I think that it's actually Immanuel Kant who played the key role in the development of liberalism that makes it a vehicle today for illiberal excess or liberal excess. And two things about Kant, and here I'm drawing primarily from Kant's very important essay on perpetual peace. But you ask, how could an essay with the explicit intention of setting up a system that would make the world completely pacific result in illiberal excess? And I think there are two aspects of Kant that are critical here. First is Kant's view of the international state of nature. Kant, of all the social contract theorists, was the one who thought that the state of nature between states was so dangerous that it couldn't be left unregulated, and that the social contract that Hobbes and Locke and other social contract theorists were content to leave focus simply on states as one state among many, eventually had to be spread over the entire world in order for perpetual peace to come about. And then the second point that seems clear in Kant is this notion that liberalism is so attractive that getting the rest of the world to buy into this program for perpetual peace will be a pretty straightforward and, in fact, unproblematic exercise. Okay. Now, the liberal tradition in America is bipartisan, in my view. And people like Woodrow Wilson and Ronald Reagan fit quite comfortably in it. And even people like Bill Clinton and George Bush. And I think those were the two best pictures I could find of those guys. Now, here's the argument. If I were to have made this presentation a couple of years ago, the idea that George Bush and the neoconservatives were liberals might have struck a lot of people as being a bit of a stretch. And in fact, I've actually been thinking about this particular issue for a long time. But a lot of people, a lot of scholars and other people in the punditry that have thought a lot about sort of the political, philosophical undergirdings of contemporary American foreign policy debates have come to see that, in fact, neoconservatism and classic American liberalism share a remarkable number of common premises. And I identified 8 in this particular table, looking at issues like whether the individual or the group ought to be the most important factor in society, what's the natural condition of man, can we count on human rationality, is human nature fungible or malleable, and is society improvable? What's more important, norms or power? The role of international institutions, and what should be the role of the military in states' foreign policy? Now, I make the argument that really in 6 out of these 8, and almost 7 out of these 8, neoconservatism and liberalism is almost almost indistinguishable from each other. The one major difference you see is on point 7 here on the role of international institutions, where one of the great departures of the Bush administration has been its absolute disdain for operating through international institutions or multilaterally. But when you think about it, that's not such a big difference. That's a tactical difference about how you get what you want in the world. And when you look at the larger strategic objectives of a lot of previous administrations, and here I'll focus a bit on the continuities between the Clinton and the Bush administrations, the differences are actually much smaller than one would think. Now, I teach a course every year on American national security policy, and I always have the students read a very important document that every administration does, usually once in each term, called the National Security Strategy. The Clinton administration did 2 of them. The Bush administration, Bush 43 administration, has just issued its 2nd one. I've always felt, I never say this to the students beforehand, but that if I took the cover page off and if I whited out 1 or 2 words, that most reasonably well-educated Americans would have a hard time figuring out which one was the Bush administration and which one was the Clinton administration. I'll talk in some detail about what I see as the main continuities here. But the point is that the Bush administration and contemporary neoconservatives fit pretty easily in America's liberal tradition. And in fact, when you think about the Bush administration in historical context, what's remarkable is as much the continuities as the discontinuities. Let's go back to those these unique premises of American liberalism. Development is easy. Well, I'm here at the LBJ school. Elsbeth Rostow isn't here, but Walt Rostow's ghost is no longer in the building. I mean, still is in the building. The whole Charles River development crowd of economists in the 1950s and early 1960s epitomized this notion that economic development is basically the trajectory of most of the world. And if there are problems, it's just a matter of a little bit of social engineering, and those obstacles can be removed. Now, the Bush administration in the 2002 National Security Strategy had a whole section talking about its new development strategy, the Millennium Challenge accounts. And again, what you see there in a different way, I mean, the Charles River crowd had a different theory of economics than the economists that are advising the Bush administration, but both share a fundamental optimism that with just a few changes in incentives, economic development will take off in parts of the world that it hadn't before. So economic development is easy. That's been a long-standing common element in American foreign policy. Political development is easy. And here you see the real continuities between Bush and Clinton. The key part in both the Clinton National Security Strategy and the Bush National Security Strategy, the central role of the democratic peace theory in their view of the world, it just jumps right out from the page at you. And in both cases, both administrations believe not only that democracy will come to large parts of the world, especially with a little help from Uncle Sam, but also that once that democracy does come, it's going to fundamentally change the nature of international politics. Which brings us to this all good things goes together, which is another common aspect in the democratic peace in both the Clinton and the Bush administrations. Democracies not only don't go to war with each other, they don't sponsor terrorism against each other, they don't engage, or they're more likely to engage in free trade with each other. I mean, when you start thinking about all the good things that democracy and democratization are going to bring to the rest of the world, it's really sort of staggering. And it's also a common theme in American foreign policy rhetoric, and particularly between the Bush and Clinton administrations. This notion that radicalism and revolution are bad. Bill knows better than I do Woodrow Wilson's abhorrence for the Mexican Revolution. He didn't say this apropos of the Mexican Revolution, but I think apropos of some revolutionaries in Santo Domingo, that we needed to go down and teach these guys good government. And the professors were usually the U.S. Marine Corps. Well, the Bush administration also sees radicalism as being a source of our problems in the world today. This rhetoric about Islamofascism, or the marriage of Islamic fundamentalism and technology, is a common bugbear in Bush and neoconservative thinking about why the global war on terrorism is so perilous. And then finally, this notion of democracy being more important than political order. Think of Jimmy Carter, who was willing to put the screws on authoritarian American allies, even when it was highly likely that they would lose power, and lose power to people, particularly in Latin America, who were not as friendly to the United States as our dictator friends. You see the exact same rhetoric today in the Bush administration. Donald Rumsfeld's comments, for example, when it became clear that there was large-scale looting and other social disorder in Iraq. I mean, what was his phrase for dismissing that? Freedom's untidy. And he would later give a speech at the Council on Foreign Relations where he would compare the chaos in Baghdad in late April and May of 2003 to the instability in America after the American Revolution. But you see it more recently. The Bush administration's commitment to the proposition that democracy is more important than order was tested explicitly in the spring of 2005 when it was clear that an election in the Palestinian Authority was likely to bring to power a Hamas government. And the Israelis and a lot of other people came to the Bush administration and said, look, if this election goes through, we're likely to have what we have now, a Hamas government. And even explicitly recognizing that, both Bush and Condi Rice said, you know, look, that may be the case, but this is democracy, and we've got to accept what comes out of it. And then when Israel and Lebanon went to war this year, Condi Rice dismissed it as the birth pangs of a new Middle East. The idea that, yeah, it could be pretty ugly in the short term, but that this is going to produce a really fundamental change in the way the world will operate once democracy becomes well instilled in the region. And in fact, the administration has explicitly said that the problem in the Middle East is stability. There's too much stability in the Middle East. What we need is more instability of the sort that overthrows non-democratic regimes and ultimately brings a democratic regime to power. Okay, so the point is that I think it's pretty clear that the Bush administration in fact, buys into these premises of American liberalism. Okay, so the really controversial argument, it seems to me, in this talk, although I'll find out just what's controversial and what's not when we get to the Q&A, is the argument that current American illiberalism is, in fact, rooted in the administration's link with America's liberal tradition. And I'm getting a little bit short of time, but I want to take 5 minutes and run through that, and then I will stop there and leave my defense of realism as an alternative for perhaps for the Q&A. The evidence, it seems to me, that it's the liberal tradition that's causing a lot of this illiberalism really comes down to two things. First of all, the Bush administration is using big L liberal rationales to justify its illiberal policies. Okay, so these are policies that are being justified in liberal tradition terminology. And secondly, lots of people who would fall within the liberal camp in American politics, a surprising number of them are buying into these illiberal policies. So the confluence of these two things makes me think that it's the liberal tradition that's the common theme behind it. Let's talk about hegemony and empire. Okay, remember Madeleine Albright's famous characterization of the United States as the indispensable nation? I mean, the entire rationale for a lot of what the Clinton administration did was the notion that without American hegemony, a lot of the things in the world that we were hoping for, including the continuing peace in Europe, the suppression of ethnic conflict, things like that, wouldn't happen without American leadership. So American leadership was a good thing. American hegemony was a good thing. So when Condi Rice talks about America as the world's guardian, the difference between what she's saying and what Madeleine Albright were saying really isn't all that different. They both basically believe in a notion of benign hegemony. Now, yeah, the Clinton administration, and if Jim were here, I'm sure he would make this point, thought a lot more warmly and enthusiastically about international institutions. There's sort of nobody outside the Clinton administration that ever really fell for that as a belief that the institutions would ever, or that the United States would ever subordinate itself to these institutions, as opposed to just operating through these institutions. Preventive war. This isn't a new thing either with the Bush administration. When the president gave his famous address at West Point arguing that we're in a new age in which he couldn't wait for threats to actually gather, well, it was Condi Rice that said we can't wait for the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud. That, in fact, was an argument that lots of people bought into, and not just people in the Republican Party. You had lots of liberals that found that argument about Iraq, for example, to be quite compelling. And in fact, even as of a week ago, the New York Times, in a otherwise really excoriating article on the Bush administration's mishandling of Iraq, still endorsed the basic notion that preventive war in Iraq was a good thing, and that the problem was not in the inception of the war, but rather in its execution. And that's pretty broad across the political spectrum. Joe Biden continually, at least until quite recently, would say the problem with the Bush administration is they went to war too soon and by themselves. The implication being that if they'd waited a little bit longer and gotten one more UN resolution, the Iraq war would have been okay. Restrictions on civil liberties here at home and some of the more extreme infringements that come from the USA Patriot Act it's no surprise that John Ashcroft was enthusiastic about that, but what happens, or what does it say when America's most noted civil libertarian, Alan Dershowitz, also endorses a fundamental rethinking of restrictions on state power in wartime? And the most egregious example of that, it seems to me, has been on the issue of torture and rendition. And again, it's sort of not surprising when you would hear people on the right who would argue that torture had to be a ready weapon in the global war on terrorism, but the number of people on the left that jumped on this bandwagon, people like Charles Schumer, Jay Rockefeller, Dershowitz, Jean Bethke Elstein, Michael Walzer. I mean, all of these people, one way or another, came around to endorsing the view that in the global war on terrorism, torture, was a defensible tool of statecraft. And the argument here, again, it seems to me, paradoxically, you can draw from liberal tradition type thinking. The idea, and this is what you saw, and a couple of years ago, Frank Gavin had John Yoo, the Bolt Hall professor who had worked for Ashcroft and had written a lot of the legal justification, both for the treatment of enemy combatants and things like that. You made the argument, not so much here, but in other places, that the enemy combatants in the global war on terrorism should not be afforded the protections of the Geneva Convention because they had placed themselves beyond the pale of civilization. Okay, an argument that Elstein endorsed fully and endorsed from a good old liberal perspective. Okay. So the bottom line, it seems to me here, is it's sort of no accident that from basically September 11th or September 12th, 2001 until quite recently, and I'm not even persuaded that there's been a really fundamental change on the liberal side of the political spectrum in this country. There hasn't been a really fundamental challenge to the Bush administration's waging of the global war on terrorism. The arguments have been tactical, but the larger objective, the idea that the global war on terrorism represents a much more perilous and dangerous threat than anything else we've faced, World War IV, the idea that the threat is existential, that it's a threat to our way of life, and the notion that the only way we're going to win this war is by extirpating, either by democratizing or by winning a Carthaginian peace, that's not really challenged except in very small quarters, it seems to me, in the rest of the American political spectrum. Now, if I had more time, I would tell you how realism and realpolitik would be the panacea. But what I want to do, because I want to have plenty of time for people to sort of set me straight on this, is to say that basically what I'm arguing for is not an overturning of domestic liberalism in America, but rather what I think I'm making is a very Hartzian argument that our liberalism needs to be checked by a non-liberal way of looking at the world. And realism, realpolitik, is the ultimate non-liberal view of international politics. I guess if I had a soundbite, I'd say I'm for liberalism in one country. I want a theory of liberalism in one country, Locke at home, Machiavelli abroad. And I'll say more about that in the Q&A.
Thank you, Mike. I think you set up a great Q&A to come, because you, of course, reserved your big punch for it. But
You're saying the rest of the talk was so weak.
no, that's not. No, it's just a bigger punch. But in any event, I'm gonna interject. I mean, after I'll put my picture up here, and you didn't explain that. I have my own notions about this. I'm not going to ask you to explain it. I'm sure other people have questions too. But I wanted to poke on. Strikes me that the kind of key part of your talk was this 8-point table of yours. That you had 8 different things that you might care about how conservatives, liberals, or neocons think about it. And you said, gee, when you sort of look at this, neocons and liberals kind of match up on 6 of them, and that's pretty good. They pretty much look like liberals. 6.5. And then you went after, you said, okay, I'm going to go after number 7, which is the one where it looks like they're really different. I'm going to talk about international institutions. And you just whiffed on number 1, right? I mean, you didn't go for it, right? Which is the big difference. You sort of all these other here I'm gonna offer you a story here, which is I think even a better story than yours on why number 7 is not important. The role of international institutions. I think you're right that international institutions are fundamentally tactical. Right, and that's what was your thing. It's you have the same goals. It's just a question of do you want a multilateral group or a unilateral mode of achieving them. But I think even more, the neocons actually sign up for international institutions quite a bit. They just don't like the ones we currently have, and the reason they don't like the ones we currently have is that there are a whole bunch of illiberal states in them. And you should go back. Zalmay Khalilzad, before he was Viceroy for the United States, wrote an article where he proposed ZOPTO would be our new international institution that he really liked. It was the Zone of Peace Treaty Organization. And it's straight out of your Kant story. The neocon vision was we're going to have international institutions that are going to help us regulate the international environment, but only with liberal countries. And this is kind of the way we act. We don't have a ZOPTO, but we have the coalitions of the willing with the people we like. I mean, I think fundamentally the neocons are perfectly happy with international institutions. The trouble is the individual versus group is the core difference. That liberals believe that individual rights are the whole point of having a government is to protect individual rights. That's why we sign up for it. These rights are, some of them may be, there's a string of rights, some may be alienable, some of them aren't, right? This is the fundamental core of liberalism, and I just don't get how it could ever be the case that a liberal policy would lead to the infringements on domestic infringements on someone who's in the same social contract as you, infringing on their individual rights. I don't see how the willingness of neocons to do that suggests to me they're fundamentally not liberals to begin with. Now, infringing on the individual rights of people who aren't in our social contract, there's people in the Middle East who are Islamofascists. That's no problem. But I think your story just kind of falls apart on the U.S. domestic policy side.
I mean, that's a couple of excellent points. Most of Hartz's liberal tradition in America, and Gene, I'm over here from College Station to give you yet more remedial reading that your half-baked education at MIT didn't give you. But in Hartz's the liberal tradition in America, there really is only one chapter on foreign policy, and there are 10 chapters on American domestic policy, where Hartz makes an argument. Maybe you'd find it persuasive, maybe you wouldn't, about how liberalism leads to domestic illiberalism. Now, you said the right thing, but I think you didn't understand how you were saying it. So let me say it a somewhat different way. In Hartz's view, and I've sort of come around to thinking that this is true, mostly from my experience at faculty meetings over the last 20 years. liberals are very intolerant of non-liberals. And so it's not so much the social contract, but rather an intolerance of anybody that doesn't buy into the liberal project. And that's where you can see even somebody committed in principle to individual rights. But if you believe that individual rights can only be protected by everybody believing essentially, the same canon on this, then all of a sudden you can see paradoxically where the problem can come from. So, it's sort of like, Skokie, Nazis marching in Skokie. I mean, the hard cases like that, where a lot of people that in principle, and for good individualist reasons are, committed to liberalism, but choke when it comes to, the really hard cases. So for Hartz, and remember, Hartz was writing in the 1950s during the McCarthy era, and was seeing a similar sort of thing in terms of domestic politics. That you weren't surprised when the John Birch Society, was on board with some of this stuff. But when a lot of other people, were supportive of some of that, from different parts of the political spectrum, then all of a sudden, it started looking a little bit suspicious, especially when you could tell a story that was philosophically consistent, based on liberal values, for why you would violate somebody's individual rights to be a communist, for example, or to be a Nazi and march in Skokie.
So your story is actually that liberals don't believe in individual rights either. Liberals believe in some individual rights as long as the group commitment to liberalism is somehow preserved, right?
No, I'd say it differently, and this is why I think Kant, or at least my understanding of Kant, is important, because the Kantian program for perpetual peace is a teleological program that eventually, through the spread of republicanism, we're going to have a system that's going to take war out of international politics. So down the line, you've got a system that essentially is going to be heaven on earth. But the problem is in the short term, in order to get to that point, you're going to have to you're going to have to bring out the brass knuckles sometimes, and you saw that. Please.
I want to follow on his because it seems to me you're arguing against Eugene's point based on a realistic version of what the individual is. In other words, how they act rather than what the philosophy is. So to me, that's a shift in the ground of argument. It'd be like arguing against Christianity based on how Christians act. So
no. What I was trying to do is to argue that the philosophical principles, and that's why I brought Kant into it, because I think it's clearer in Kant, in the interest of achieving the Republican League in the short term, you can do some illiberal things, and it's not inconsistent, because it's all part of moving towards that system that will bring the League of Perpetual Peace into existence, and that's not a praxis thing. I mean, that's part of the philosophical argument.
Then I'd say there's two branches, because there was the ACLU with the scope. I mean, there really are two branches, and there's some purist individual rights people, and then maybe some more tactical ones or strategic.
I think it's a fair criticism of Hartz's argument is to say, look, not everybody has fallen in the liberal tradition, or what Arthur Schlesinger would call the vital center of American politics, consistently over the past 200 years. And I think that's a fair point. But, when you, on the other hand, when there is broad-scale consensus that, does span, what for most of us are the legitimate bounds of political discourse in this country, then there's something important going on. And what's been interesting, particularly, has been how irrelevant the ACLU has been recently on these issues, particularly in the global war on terrorism.
Yeah, because we're not really liberal, I think. I mean, you can draw a different conclusion on that.
Right, yeah.
I'm just talking about the logic of it.
Yes, no, I understand. I think that's a fair point. Bill?
Mike, I wonder if you're explaining too much here. Because in contrast to the 1950s when Louis Hartz was writing, where there was a fair consensus on American policy toward the Soviet Union, toward communism. And you can see that by the fact that when the Republicans replaced the Democrats after the 1952 elections, and vice versa after the 1960 elections, American policy, American outlook, American ideology stayed fairly constant. But imagine in December 2000 that one vote on the Supreme Court had gone differently, and Al Gore had become president. I find it hard to imagine that we would be in the same position we're in today. And so it seems to me that much of what you're explaining rests on this very narrow decision in 2000. I don't think we have a consensus regarding the global war on terror. I think we have an administration that has very strong views and has managed to seize the initiative and pull much of the American political system along in its way. But I think that you're perhaps explaining more than actually exists in drawing this parallel between Louis Hartz
Is
and...
that like making it up?
No, I think you're stretching it.
Let me say two things. One facetious, and that'll give me time to think about the serious response to it. This idea that things would be different if Al Gore had not been robbed in Florida in 2000, I think is a fairy tale that we tell ourselves. Because what it does is it gives us a way of disassociating ourselves from what's happened since then. And I think a couple of things to keep in mind. When you look at the trajectories in the 90s, and that's why I wish Jim was here, because you'd think he'd elected himself Pope. There'd be so much white smoke coming out of his ears when I make this argument. But the truth of the matter is that the continuities between what Clinton was doing on a lot of these things. Remember, when was the Iraq Freedom Act passed? 1998, it seems to me. Another crude measure, but one that's sort of, I think a good measure of how the U.S. is behaving in the world is look at the operational tempo of the U.S. Armed Forces. And there's a huge spike that starts basically around 1993. So this increase in an assertive and muscular foreign policy begins much earlier. Now, I think that, in fact, and here we're talking about counterfactual history, and so you're a historian, so your counterfactual history is probably better than mine.
But past 1990 doesn't count.
No, but I'm a political scientist, so actually making up history. So if we're in counterfactual history, gives me a decided advantage. I think that Al Gore is elected, 9/11 happens, and we essentially do the same thing, save maybe we would have waited a couple more months for that last UN resolution and gone in with a few more countries as part of the coalition of the willing. I'm really skeptical that we would have that Gore would have been fundamentally different than Bush. Now, I have a vested interest because I'm making an argument about continuity rather than change.
I was just going to jump in and to add fuel to your fire, because it does seem to me one could at least speculate that if Gore had been president, the country would have been much more mobilized after 9/11. I mean, one of the great criticisms of Bush was he didn't, for instance, mobilize, let the citizens get involved in the war on terror. I think that Gore would have been much more likely to do that, which would have been a more liberal, and on the home front, I think might have been people getting involved and looking for these terrorists under the bed and so on. I think that might have been more of a Gore, at least as a possibility.
Yeah. God bless you, Alan. So, just sort of the bottom line. You're absolutely right. A lot hinges for a lot of people when I make this argument on whether they think there's a fundamental difference between George W. Bush and Al Gore. My sense is that given the trajectory that the Clinton administration was already on so many of these things, this debate about torture, by the way, didn't begin after 9/11/2000. This is a debate that began in liberal circles in the 1970s. I mean, when was Michael Walzer's famous essay on dirty hands, the necessity of dirty hands? I mean, that was already in the like 1972 or something like that. So this 9/11 is, I think, more of a break in people's mind than it really is in terms of trajectories, which isn't to say that it wasn't important, but I don't want to overstate it. Josh?
Okay, I want to pick at your characterization of number 7 in your chart. And I guess I think your argument about the messianic transformational component to liberalism is right, but I think you downplay the differences between liberal internationalists and neoconservatives. Internationalists, I think, are much more likely to counsel self-restraint and self-binding to multilateral instruments, which would potentially create very different patterns of state behavior from neoconservative foreign policy. And I think that matters because on page 39 you suggest that liberal powers unconstrained by threat are necessarily expansionist, and that domestic ideology can't temper a liberal state. So that cuts against your ultimate call for, or normative appeal for realist pragmatism, that by your logic, statesmen have no agency to follow in the absence of counter.
No. That's, well, I'll go back, and it may be a defect of infelicitous prose rather than intent. But all I'm saying is that, look, without the constraint of significant counterbalancing force internationally, domestic politics, in particular ideology, can play a greater role than it would, for example, during the Cold War. But I don't think it's inevitable that, I think liberalism is deeply rooted in American political culture, and we realists are going to have a hard time arguing against it, but it's not a foregone conclusion, because this is the stuff of political debates. But the argument that you cite there was not intended to be structural determinism and say without countervailing power we're going to go crazy.
But it hinges then on 7 not really mattering in terms of the actual conduct of foreign policy.
Yeah, that's the point I wanted to come to, because I was thinking about this. Anne-Marie Slaughter and John Eikenberry and the whole shadow Hillary cabinet in waiting at Princeton have this. Frank's probably involved in this. Am I maligning something?
No. He's a competitor of the Princeton project.
Yeah. Yes. In any case, how many people know about this Princeton project on national security? Anne-Marie Slaughter, who's the dean of the Woodrow Wilson School, and John Eikenberry and a bunch of other like-minded people, including Dean Steinberg, are part of this Princeton project. It's like a Council on Foreign Relations study group on steroids that basically, it looks a lot like a standard administration national security strategy. It was organized in working groups on grand strategy, and international economics, on democracy, and things like that. So anyhow, and these people are all, people I strongly suspect are angling for a position in a Democratic administration. And so part of the purpose of this is to present a Democratic alternative to the Bush administration. So they rolled out, they've been working on this for a couple of years, and at great expense to the Woodrow Wilson, or to Princeton University, and a bunch of foundations, lots of dinners and lots of people flying to cushy places. They rolled out a report. And if you read the summary memo that Anne-Marie, who's an international lawyer, peace through law, and John Eikenberry, who's Mr. International Institutions, Josh, it's music to your ears. You think there's really something here that suggests a difference between what the Bush administration is doing and what a putative Democratic alternative administration would do. But then you get into the really substantive papers on grand strategy and all these other issues. And again, you sort of wipe some things out, you change the watermark on the paper, and it looks indistinguishable from the Bush administration on a lot of things. Hegemony hasn't gone away. It's just called U.S. leadership, and it's justified in the theory of hegemonic stability, but it's still hegemony, in my view. And I guess I don't know if you saw the debate on TPM Cafe that the Eikenberry and Slaughter had invited a bunch of people to react to the draft, and Steve Walt, analyzed it, and one of his key points, which I think is a fair reading of the document, is, the problem the Democrats have had for the past 6 years is they don't have an alternative, a substantive alternative to what the Bush administration is advocating, and it becomes blindingly obvious when you look at the substantive parts of this report. They say a lot about we're going to do everything through institutions, but they're still talking about doing the same things, and it may be in the velvet glove, but there's still the mailed fist of American power. This guy, were you trying to?
Thank you. Well, I think that
you should introduce yourself to
I'm
Mike.
sorry, Jack Sussman is my name.
He's a regular.
Regular. One of the important things that we all need to do here is to bend over backwards sometimes where necessary to see if there's some ground for agreement on international issues. I think that that's largely been the case for a lot of people over the past several years, but to take more explicit issue with 3 of your 4 arguments, it seems as though, and those were based upon the 4 development is easy and all good things
right.
together and so on. Development being easy, you brought up the case of the Millennium Challenge accounts, which really are far, far cry from anything that the Clinton administration would have dared to lend its name to. I think it's a real cheap way of not being anything down. There's been some management problems over there. People have departed and so on. It's really a mess.
By the way, I didn't compare him to Clinton. I compared him to the Charles River,
Walt Rostow.
Stages of economic growth. Well, that happens to be my field. What I would argue is that at that point they didn't have the vehicle called microcredit. You see, all they had were strategic hamlets. If they had microcredit, the world would have been a little bit different. Okay, number 2, all good things go together. I think that the difference between the way that the Bush people have been looking at the world and other administrations have is that there has been really no concrete application of principles to the present situation on the ground. So that would be my argument as far as the difference between the neocons and the liberal tradition, therefore possibly disqualifying the neocons from your argument there.
Could you say just one more sentence about what you mean by that? I mean, is it the case, just so I'm clear what you're arguing, Jack, is it the case that the neoconservatives really don't believe in the democratic peace theory? That they really never intended to democratize Iraq?
Well, I think that they intended to overthrow Saddam Hussein, and that their depth of thought that was put into this project has been superficial from the word go.
Okay, I would say 2 things, because I actually thought a lot about that. The lack of planning for phase 4, the nation-building piece of it, it is what everybody agrees was a huge lacuna. But whether that indicates that the neoconservatives of the Bush administration were uninterested in democracy doesn't follow. And in fact, Wolfowitz explicitly addressed that, because there was a lot of discussion in the late fall of 2002 and in the winter of 2003, when it was clear we were going And when belatedly the Phase 4 planning started coming online, and there were some people who said, look, let's just get rid of Saddam, and maybe we'll install a military junta. I guess Elliot Cohen is banging the drum on that today. But Wolfowitz at the time, and a lot of other people in the administration, explicitly rejected that and said, we're not going to replace Saddam with another Saddam. Now, you could say that's a stupid thing to do, and I think the verdict of history supports that, but that doesn't prove that they weren't ideologically committed and didn't believe that getting rid of Saddam, in fact, would increase the likelihood of a democratic political system emerging in Iraq. Wolfowitz, and I know him a little bit, but I followed his career pretty extensively. The guy is really an idealist. And I think a lot of other neoconservatives are too. And so it's sort of easy to caricature neoconservatives as being money grubbing crooks like Richard Pearl. But I don't think Pearl is at all representative of the people that were the real intellectual architects of the larger Bush administration Weltanschauung. They were true believers, in my view. But
we have only a few more minutes, so it looks like we have three questions. So let's take Ron, Frank, and I'm sorry, I don't know your name. So in that order, Ron.
I'm really sympathetic to the broad argument.
I know how sympathetic you are because I just looked at your paper today.
I'm very sympathetic to sort of the broad argument, but let me sort of step outside my sort of sympathetic shoes and sort of play a little bit of a different role, which is to ask the question of what kind of cause is the American liberal tradition as you see it? Because a good part of the paper, if I were to characterize this uncharitably, would be about the search for confirming evidence. There's a whole lot of American foreign policy that is very much, including in the era of unipolarity, which of course be precisely the era in which you expect to see, you would argue that liberalism, the American liberal tradition would be most important. That is very much at odds with liberal prescriptions. So let's look at those. Development is easy, except of course where it isn't. That is where, of course, you have ancient hatreds like Bosnia and Rwanda, right? Places where, of course, development isn't easy, and we try to stay away from it. Democracy and promotion.
We didn't stay away from Bosnia.
Oh, we tried for an awfully long. But we tried for an awfully long time.
We did in Rwanda. We didn't in Bosnia.
Democracy promotion. Well, it depends, of course, at what point you think it's staying away. Right? Democracy promotion is important, except of course where it is imprudent, right? Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Pakistan. We are against radicalism and revolution are bad. We're against regime overthrow, except of course where it suits our purposes, right? So Algeria, 1994, when in fact we do basically tell, let's ignore the elections, right? Or even you would argue, right? Well, with regards to Palestinians today, it's not like the United States has said, well, this is the Hamas is the choice of the Palestinian people. That isn't, of course, what the United States has said. It said that may be your choice, but there are consequences. Right? So it isn't that simply, we've simply saying democracy is important in order, recognizing Hamas to be a destabilizing force in the region. The United States is, in fact, trying to produce a different kind of order, maybe not through supporting a coup or whatnot, but so be it. So question one simply of what kind of cause? And question two, since we haven't addressed your larger agenda for a realist culture of foreign policy, let me sort of give you the opportunity to talk about it by asking the following. You say that you want to see a culture of sort of foreign policy realism before the world truly pushes back. And I guess I would ask you, what is your theory of cultural change? Because it seems to me that until the world truly pushes back, I doubt that we'll see any kind of cultural change along those lines.
Yeah.
Quick. Yes, these huge questions. After I warned him that we have not that much
Well, he's
time.
going to dinner tonight, so what I can do is I can tell the rest of the audience that I actually have the slam dunk answer to Ron's questions.
Kind of like the Iraqi WMD.
Yeah, but Gene is right. I mean, you sort of asked two questions that really deserve an hour answer apiece. The first question, it seems to me, is a little bit of an unfair question because it assumes that there's an alternative theory of state behavior or American foreign policy that can explain a lot more than this. And the fact that I can't explain 25% of American foreign policy in the past 5 years, seems to me, unless you've got a theory that explains 80% or 85 or 90, you haven't put any money on the table. No theory explains everything. The question is it a theory that explains some important tendencies and continuities? And when there are exceptions, they're exceptions that people have to work very hard to explain away or to get around. So that's a short and unsatisfying answer. I'll give you, or at least I'll tell everybody else, I'll give you a longer answer in a little bit that'll be, at least they would find more satisfying if they were there for dinner. Second question is a theory of cultural change. And I sort of suspect that both you and Gene are trying to back me into a corner and from different directions and say, you, Mike Desch, are the big critic of culture and international affairs. And here you are making this culturalist argument. That's what he was doing. I know.
I admit it was unfair.
No, but I think
I'm actually not trying to do that.
Yeah, but
I'm saying that for others.
Yeah, my view is that that these are political issues that people can argue about, and it's that, again. I coming here as the arch realist and arguing against structural determinism may seem a little bit out of character, but I think that people can be persuaded, and I think the fact that our nation-building effort in Iraq has clearly come a cropper, and Afghanistan isn't going very well either. Now you got Hillary Clinton of all people talking about the need for democratic realism, and you have smarter people like Frank Fukuyama or Charles Krauthammer, who already 2 years ago were saying, we got to find a way to integrate realism and idealism in a way that gets the synergies from both of them. I think you're right. I mean, a big foreign policy failure is going to inevitably cause a rethink, but I don't think that we necessarily need that in order to get a change. That people may be persuaded that the foreign policy that the liberal tradition has undergirded for the United States in the global war on terrorism has been a mistake, and it looks like it's going in the wrong direction. And people pointing that out, it may change. So I think there's room for politics in this argument.
Would you shoot me if I skip you, Frank?
Yes.
Okay.
No, let Frank.
Go ahead. Quick.
Well, it's always good to have our favorite Aggie here in Longhorn territory, and I think you fared much better today than your team is going to fare in about a week and a half. But
God, talking about damning with faint praise.
When I saw the title of your talk, I thought what you were going to talk about is you're going to say the puzzle would be why has American foreign policy been so bad since 9/11? And I thought, knowing you, the answer would be because it hasn't been realistic. I thought, well, that would be nice. I essentially agree with that. But no, your puzzle was essentially why are we so illiberal? And I thought, okay, that's interesting. And the second point was we've been that way for a while. And then the third was that it's liberalism's fault, which essentially means that there's been no really realist counterweight to this. And I thought, well, this is interesting. One, ideas seem to really matter in this argument, which I think is something that you're going to talk about. But two, you weren't really arguing the policy was bad since 9/11. You were just saying it's illiberal and that this is part of a long tradition. So I thought, well, if this is the case, have American foreign policies been largely illiberal based on Hartzian liberalism or Kantian liberalism for quite some time? And if so, how to explain why, for the most part, American foreign policy has been, in a larger sense, pretty successful? I mean, you put Woodrow Wilson up there, you pretty much argue that just about every president has not been a realist, but in fact has been part of this illiberal, liberal background, yet policy has been pretty successful. say, over the last century than with the absence of realism. So my question would be, how would you explain the success of American policy, given that there has not been any realism? What does it say about realism? Then I want to kind of offer a way I would explain this. When you were talking about the characteristics of the illiberalism of recent policy since 9/11, it looked like the Cold War to me. We certainly had policies, as you know, preemption, stored coups, covert action. And on the home front, McCarthyism certainly exceeded anything that we've seen in the Patriot Act by, I'd say, a considerable amount. Yet the Cold War was generally considered largely successful. And if I were to say why it is, I'd say a lot of this was rhetoric. It really didn't matter that we were really realist at heart. There's a lot of liberal or illiberal rhetoric. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is, how does realism fit into your story of explaining North American foreign policy? I mean, it seems absent, and I want to know where it is. And if it is absent, how do you explain what would seem to be a certain amount of success in the last century?
Well, I think you've got to sort of disaggregate the argument, and I do make it explicitly in the papers. I think the structural constraints of the Cold War forced us to be pretty moderate in how we waged the Cold War against the Soviet Union. But that wasn't. I think our heart wasn't in it. I mean, we're what are we, the 50th anniversary of the Hungarian uprising, where I think there were a lot of people that really wanted to support the Hungarian rebels against the Soviets, for a good spreading democracy reason. But we didn't. We didn't for good realist reasons, because we weren't willing to countenance World War III with the Soviet Union. Now, so do we say realism is ascendant in American foreign policy throughout the Cold War? I would say, yeah, vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and in Europe, we acted, by the dictates of realism. But read Bob Packenham's book on liberal America in the Third World, and how our development strategy in the Third World and our foreign policy more generally was animated by liberal excess. Vietnam being the key case in point.
So structural constraints are what matters, and why do these ideas matter at all?
No, but as I respond, see, Frank, the problem is you wanted a straw man to come over from Aggie Land. The straw man is the structural realist who thinks structure is all that matters. And maybe such a straw man exists on the southwest shore of Lake Michigan. But I don't even think there that he exists. That most of us, and I offer my own work as a humble example, who think that structure matters under certain circumstances, have spilled a lot of ink describing what those circumstances are, why structure matters, and why it doesn't. And in those circumstances, why it doesn't, what other factors might explain state behavior. So ideas do matter. And I think even this imaginary straw man on the southwest shore of Lake Michigan, if he were here and you were to ask him, do ideas matter? He would say sure. And indeed, his professional life is a testament to that, because he's constantly throwing lots of ideas out there, some of which have got him in a lot of trouble recently. But the idea that structural realism is a billiard ball theory of world politics and that ideas are irrelevant is a caricature of most realists, including Kenneth Waltz. Realism has a much more nuanced.
That's not what I was arguing.
Much as I agree with you, Mike, we're at the end of our time, and we have one more very patient person who's going to ask you the last question, and you're going to give a quick answer. Please.
I'm not a clinical scientist, but I'm studying history and primitive things. And I would like you to react to it. One is, why do you use the word liberalism instead of idealism? I think idealism is more contrasting with realism. I feel that the way you both may be for political scientists who understand classical liberalism, but I think it's a very lowest form, and people confuse it, and there's a lot of opposition with the word liberal. So if you use the word idealism, like Wilsonian idealism versus the Roosevelt realism, that would be more logical. I think it would be, your argument would be stronger. That's my first point. The second point is, and I don't know, people are going to be upset with that, but the word terrorism bothers me. It's been used historically against people that we don't understand why they're doing it. We say, oh, this terrorism against our way of life, they won't destroy us. Maybe there's some legitimacy. I don't know how realism view the terrorists. Who are they? Are they just people fighting for ideals, or are they, do they have a realistic base to war against us? We call it war against terror. I don't even understand what that means. Yeah. It's just a slogan.
Yeah, those are both excellent questions. I'll just focus on the second one, because the first one I think would just isn't as interesting as the second one. You're right, but I have an argument for focusing on liberalism. I don't think there's enough time to get into it. But the argument about terrorism, and if I'd gotten into the final part of the talk about the advantages to looking at the world through realpolitik eyes, it would be precisely on that issue that realism is superior. Terrorism is a form of warfare. It's a form of asymmetric conflict. And many groups have used that form of asymmetric conflict throughout history. Sometimes we call them freedom fighters when there are people that we like, and sometimes we call them terrorism or terrorists when they're people we don't like. But you're absolutely right. The problem is talking about a global war on terrorism. You don't fight terrorism. It'd be like having a global war on landmines. I know we do have such a thing, but it's silly. What you declare war on are other people and other states who are threatening you or who are opposing you in some way. And the problem with the global war on terrorism is that it's almost a completely meaningless topic, because if you took it to its logical extent, maybe this is what some people want by talking about a global war on terrorism, then the war with Al-Qaeda, which I firmly support and advocate waging as ruthlessly as possible, ought to be part and parcel of Putin's war against the Chechen rebels, against the Chinese war against the Uyghurs. Part of the reason after 9/11 that the world rallied to the United States was genuine sympathy for America as a result of the attack on the World Trade Center. But there were also people, Putin and the Chinese, who understood that the global war on terrorism was a bandwagon that you could hop on, and you could camouflage a lot of things on that bandwagon that otherwise would look pretty ugly. So I agree with you completely on that point.
So what would be the realist approach to the so-called war against terrorism?
I think we would we would advocate going after militarily, diplomatically, economically terrorist groups that target the United States. So we wage war on Al-Qaeda, which declared war on us. I don't think we need to include Hamas or Hezbollah or Islamic Jihad or a lot of other groups that may be waging war against other states in our war against terrorism, simply because we don't like the method that they're using to fight that war. But you don't fight a method, you fight individuals or states.
Well, thank you for a highly interesting and entertaining talk. Generated a good discussion, and I look forward to more discussion in the immediate and later aftermath. Thank you.